Hello, greetings to everyone. Good morning to most people in Australia and anyone who's tuning in from anywhere. Good now. Thank you very much for timing to tune to this transmission of a talk this morning on observing the mind as the object. And this is very important because if you're really in meditation, whatever you're focusing on, whatever you're seeing or thinking is really your mind. But when we are not really in good meditation, when we are not we are not really sane or wise or thoughtful, we think it is as an external object that is the thing, as if the thing exists independently, something as itself as an entity independent of our mind or our thoughts. And that's one of the main causes of confusion and blaming and pointing finger, is because one thinks the object or things one see are independent objects. And one thinks it is the person, one thinks it is what it does or what it didn't, and therefore one sees the object quite as existing from its own side, and then we are so driven in believing that it is so. And that is this kind of perception doesn't require practice. This perception is called deluded perception. Deluded sees the object as the independent entity that exists entirely on its own out there, and without any acknowledgement how much a role our mind creates unconsciously in making the object appear as itself. One is not conscious and literate how the object that one is seeing or observing is none other than one's thought about the object. That's not the thought about the object, opinion of the object, is not only thought and opinion of the person, but not the reality of the object where actually it is. So that's why even the external object does not appear identically to three different persons focusing it, because they are not seeing any independent entity thing in itself. And one who doesn't see the object as their own mind, and that's when they react, they overreact, and then they kind of become so driven, and that the object exists from its own side. And that time one is not meditating. One can't see one's mind as the observable object, because one can't see the mind. Mind has completely lost to its dualistic conception or improper thoughts and opinions and perception. And by doing so, one cannot observe the object as one's mind. One can only see the object as an object, Object as an object. Of course, object as an object itself is only an opinion of the mind of the object, not of the object, because if anything to do with the object, then it's the object that actually sees itself. Object doesn't have the consciousness. And so it's our opinion about our conception of the object, and then manifests as an object. So we need to be able to observe, how come that I am so unconsciously creating in my own head and label it on an object, and then believe that object is identical to what we think, and then think as the object in the object is what actually is, without thinking how much of an opinion has crafted and constructed, make oneself believe that object is independent of our mind, when actually is totally dependent on our mind. So now, people who meditate, particularly in Buddhist circles, and who really have heard a little bit of the mind-only school, will know that all appearances, be that inanimate object or animate object or whatever they see of the relative object, they see that as a reflection, projection of their own mind. Because of that, they can observe the object as one's mind, and so the object is not necessary really. Object is totally empty of the object. That's why we can do not see the object. Do not see how we are labeling here, imputing, we're naming. If you didn't name anything in your head, or conventionally call it anything, how does the object appears? Object will be completely empty of its own name, even nameless. Object is nameless. You cannot see a nameless object, can you? Because it's not an object that has an imputed name. It doesn't have this imputed dependent object on the name, because one thinks it actually is the object itself. If it's independent, it doesn't need to be labeled because it's unnamed object. As soon as it's a named object, it becomes dependent on your thought about the object. So good meditators will see the object as observing the object as the play of their own mind. When you see the play of one's own mind on the object, that shows how much a big role our mind conceives in forms opinions and labels and imputes and labels and gives the name. Because no object is produced with an initial name in it. The object itself has to be convened by namers, by society, conventional society. Usually something is named after something. A man may be named after a dog or a cat or a bull or whatever. A lot of people have surname like Bull and so on, you know. Some people's name is like a Kitchener or something like that. I mean, what does it say about the object? Does the object sound like the name? It doesn't sound anything like that. It is object itself is named after another object, which is not the same person. So this shows that how much of the object that we're observing is our only mind. When we know that the observed object is our mind at play, then at least the object itself is now no longer exists. Object no longer is propped up by the belief that it exists from its own side. Now one knows the object has been instead propped by our own mind to appear the object according to our projection, our liking, our disliking. And one has become so spellbound in believing that the object is independently there to be seen by everyone. But any second or third person were to perceive the object, they could not see the identical object seen by the first person. The reason? Because they never see object. They only see the mind and its imputation. The mind has been physically manifested as an object. Now, if you understand that, it's profoundly riveting and useful, because then your negative perception of somebody, you don't see it as them. You see that as a physical manifestation, your thought about them. And this subjective cognition of your own mind at play, therefore, will hesitate to label or designate, imputes itself as being itself, because unless you name and you put a label, the bottle doesn't say I'm orange jam or I am mango jam or anything like that. It might even have mango jam, but there is no inherently exists mango jam unless it's labeled. So labeling and naming and imputing is one of the three factors that makes things exist. If we didn't give a name, even though there is a four-legged wood that is people put things on that table, but if we didn't give the label, the thing cannot be distinguished from the chair, which also has four legs. Many things have four legs. So all four-leggeds are chair. Then actually all the cows are table as well, because they all has four legs. So unless we have labeled cat as a cat, dog as a dog, doesn't mean dog is dog, but dog, we can just label the four-footed animal dog. Since we were born, we were introduced to call it a dog. We never were consulted. We never had an opinion. We were never allowed to opinion. We just have to learn the convention of the language, terminology, and then pointing this is that and not that. And so that when you show little kids a book of animals, you point the finger to the rabbit and call it rabbit. And the boy, little infant, doesn't know why we're talking it a rabbit, because he doesn't even know rabbit. And then he slowly get indoctrinated in believing what we think the object is as if the object itself. For instance, when you're very neurotic, you're very ungrateful, you will see all kinds of bad things your mother or mother-in-law does. And it's not the mother-in-law does anything like that to you, but your projection of fear and attachment and control and domination makes yourself wanting to call that name, and the object appears as identical to the name you have chosen too. And so that's why it's amazing how our convention and the mind decide to put a label and then call something named after the thing. Now, lots of people are suffering every day because one has labeled someone, say, violent or selfish or thief or whatever, crook or, whatever negative names you have labeled, given to somebody. We are stuck with it as if the person is now identical to the name that you have given. Of course, we are not aware that the name that we have given is our thought about the object. It's not the actual object, So if the person is the actual object and name is also autonomously given to itself by itself, then everybody would know this person or this thing by that name, because it exists from the object side. No, to most people they don't. The name doesn't make any sense to them, and they have to convene to that themselves in order to adopt that name to be named after the animal, or whatever the case might be. So when we don't observe all objects as our mind, there is a danger of externalizing something existing independent of one's own opinions and label. And this doesn't need schooling. People are already thinking like that. They think the object is object, nothing to do with his mind. He doesn't realize he is using convention and language and vocabulary that is actually used by conventional people. So he himself is depending on the name named by other people, and then has chosen to name someone or something like that. So unless you have named it, the thing does not even dependently exist, let alone independently. If the thing that the name is the one you have given or some other people have given, until the name was given, the object never was the name. But after the object was given the name, then object has become identified as a new. If you say if you have a five doors doored room in your house, each of the door has a room, and neither of them has been specifically called office or guest room or something like that. But as soon as you call a room guest room, it looks like guest room exists from the room itself. It was only labeled 2 days ago to the guest room. There have never been any guests in there. Never was any guests before. But yet it's named after guests. So who chose it? Whoever named it. Whoever named it, and then it become conventionalized for others to think the object is as it is named. And they don't remember how much a bigger persuasion of the person to name something like that has therefore been introduced to people. This is what we call this, and then everybody makes sure it doesn't confuse apple for a tomato, for instance. So they say this is tomato and a tomato, and then they say it's an apple, they say no, this is a tomato. So because we have chosen to label differently, the object is simply at the whim of the mind. So are they not? Are the objects not mere projection of the mind? Yes. Why don't we know that? Because we are so deluded in thinking the object is not our thought. Their object is the object is existing from its own side. So we have this notion that something is independently or permanently or autonomously exists from its own side, which is completely untested. Because one hasn't examined this carefully, it might even appear that way. But that's how the whole Buddhist epistemology does it. It investigates why a thing, because it is labeled, because it's named. When you know that your mind did the naming, then the object is none other than your naming of the object. The object is at the whim of you giving a name, and the object doesn't appear anything contrary to that. So because of that, there's no capacity for the object to appear anything differently, because the object is dependent on the name being given to it. As soon as one knows that the object is one's thought about the object, then at least the thought about the object, if it changed, the object seems to be changed. So object is totally dependent on your naming and labeling to it. And it's only in convention. So don't take anything literally or seriously in this conventional world. And always feel free to adopt a new name or modify the name. Then the object appears differently. If there are two, we can call one as A, another as a B. But it doesn't mean the thing is A or B, second is B. But object has been given A and B, simply distinguish one from the another. So when you know that, then you realize all objects are merely imputed names by our thought. So that's called observing object as one's mind or one's thought. When you see, for instance, when you see your mother and you really have a loving feeling towards her, you can say, this is my kind mother. This is my lovely mother. But if you don't, even though she's more than lovely and she's been more than kind and gracious in her whole life because she's been totally dedicated to the children, but if you don't see your mother as a kind or caring and so person, then you might not even think as my mother. She's just this lady, So if you say this lady, then all of a sudden the object is simply this lady. Object is no longer your mother. A lot of people have not disowned their mother, and they don't want to call my mother. They call this woman, That's still okay, But some people may call it terrible. And as soon as one calls one's mother as just a woman and something terrible, then one's thought is labeled to them after the mother. The kind or generous mother is also not independently kind and generous mother. When you call she kind mother, she looks like a kind mother. The object looks like a kind mother. Why? Because your thought has decided to identify the object as a kind. So therefore, all names and labels, conventions, are projections of the mind, or convention of mind and label as the mind. When you understand this, you will then understand what we call mind-only thought of Buddhism. That our mind only convenes, labels, adopts, and retrieves the memory of the object. The object is named after something by the mind, and so the object does not appear identical to the object, but object seems like identical to the name you've given. So therefore, if you have, object is therefore identical to the name you've given. And so if you know that object is appearing identical to the name you've given, name giver is your thought, not the object. Object does not give name to itself, nor does the object need to be named for its own side. Object is only named by people like us who need to identify that from something else or like that. So object is simply labeled by the mind of the perceiver, of the observer. The observer labels and gives a name to an object for whatever reason he does, conventional reason he does. But object itself has not been born with, is not simultaneously born with, no decided to label itself that way. It might even have labeled that way. You can then see how different the name that you have given to the object, how different the object itself has adopted a name. So when you see that, then you can see both has opinions of the same object, but their opinions are way out different. So why are there two different names and identity to the object? Is because the object itself lacks any independent entity other than at the whim of the namers and labelers and conveners. This being so, if there are 30 people who have different opinions of the one object, there will be 30 different opinions. Why? Because the object is none other than the one's thought about the object. So when you know the thought about the object is not the object, but the thought about the object, at least you don't have a lot of quarrel with the object, because the object has completely emptiness. Because you can bend and whatever you wanted to do with the object, because your mind cares to call one, and then you say it's not, and calls another. So this kind of incessant transitoriness of the name that you also couldn't make up calling something is because the object itself lacked anything discernible from its own side. It was only your opinion of the object. Now, when you meditate the mind as object, usually most people could not spot the mind to be an object. Yeah? They could not spot the mind to focus on the mind, because usually they've been so used to focusing on something else. Whether it's a Buddha image or a flower or the breath or whatever you focus, it soon looks like it is there from its own side. We don't remember how our labeling to it, how we conventionalize our mind to call it and label it, then the object appears as such. So that's why it's very important to know the relationship between the mind and its opinions, its labels, its concept, and how soon as one adopts the name and convention label and decide to call something, then the thing actually which was nothing, becomes something. So why does no object become object is because we have chosen an opinion to label to that object. Not because the object is that label, because the object is not that label. Object is not that label. Very useful to think that even if someone calls you a name, you don't get offended. Why? Because you're not anything what the person calls, let alone something independently yourself. That actually you're totally dependent on what other people calls you. If people calls you, a friend, you are a friend to them, only relative to them. But if you have another group of people on this side, they may not call you friend. So you can see that even those who calls you something, it does not independently exist. It is empty of true existence in the object from its own side. There's ample proof the object that we have labeled to is readily adopted to be with the name, and he no longer has the ordinary other name prior to that, because he's now got elevated or promoted and has given a different name. It's interesting, it's interesting that why people who call you something because they think that's the name by which they've known. But since you haven't seen each other for a long time, and maybe you have changed your name, or at least started change to be called by one of the other names, not the other name that you've given to, and they don't see you. They don't see an object in you that is then label, because in their mind they have a completely different label. So when they don't see it, they don't see you at all. Why? Because the opinion of the object has physically manifested to become identical to the object. If we know how these are the signs of how things appear to become in front of us, because we have conventionally labeled it, named it, numbered it, and put all the data and so on. Therefore, we can distinguish one from another. So that differentiability, the fact that you can make a differentiation of one thing from another, shows that your thought about the object is what makes the object look alike. Because you're so convinced and driven in believing and convincing people that is so. Now the use of this is you become less fundamentalist about being right or wrong or good or bad. You have very little opinion that warrants any long-lasting benefit of it, because the label you have given is totally dependent on many other factors, as well as your reason to label the object with them. When you become more aware of the relationship between the object and the label, and the labeler, and the labeling base, and the labeling, then you can see the labeling base itself is emptiness of the label, yeah, emptiness of the name, so even though, because it's emptiness of the name, it's quite open. Open means clear. Because it hasn't got any name, you can put a hat on it and call it name, it will be so. Why? Because there's no name, or no name, or no nameless of the person doesn't make the person nameless. A person with the name doesn't make him more like the name. But it's a convention of identifying one from the another, that our thought does the most of the convening in the head before it decided to label one thing. That shows the relationship between thought and opinion and perception. And the perception of the perceived. Perceived doesn't have even anything sweet or any flavor in it. But when one is naming the object, something to do with the flavor, then the name and the various paraphernalia through which you identify an object then reveals how most phenomena are merely labeled and not truly or independently unitarily existing from its own side. So, what a relief it is, isn't it? So then you don't see anything concrete in the object that is itself from its own self. And we also know how much part of labeling we do that makes the object look alike. And so how crafted all of these things are this dualistic conception. When you are able to compare your notes in your mind and why someone or something appears the way it does, that is either pleasantly or negatively, you don't want to have the negative feelings towards something to be snowballing in a year after year like that. You wanted to dename, you wanted to remove that name and call something else. So then, what is the something else you call? Is a name. Why you call a name? Because you're thinking. So therefore, object is actually construed in the head, thinking it is this name. And someone might actually like the name because they also wanted to have a change. Name is possible, at least in a spiritual community sense. Even though legally they have to they have to sign a deed poll and so on, saying that they will not use the old name at all, but they will instead use this new name and so on. Even though you have to do that, you have to do that because your labeling has a particular impact on the labeled. You know, some are labeled permanently, very sticky. Others are just temporarily flimsy ones that can remove. Most names should be very temporary. And even if people calls you a bad name, because the names are not the thing, names are thought about the thing. Therefore, you attach the likelihood of you becoming attached to a name or position or aversion to the same thing has not a great chance. So you can really do this exercise, I would imagine, that to observe the thought as a mind as object. Do not observe object as object, or object as a mother, or object as a husband, or object as a friend. All these things, it's how much of them is conjured up in your own mind. They don't exist independently, friend to everyone. They may like to be friend with others. They do not know how to attract friendship. So they're only friend to you because you have labeled them, and there's only few things that are good between you that are helping each other, and therefore friendship is continuing. Other than that, there is nothing definitive about friend being identical to the person, because the person's friendness of the person is only identified, labeled, and adopted by this end. If one hasn't done that process, there is nothing that exists, even with a label to its own side, but not to the other side. So that's why it is important when people call name to you for very either positive reason or very negative reason, you should not get too attached. You can say, this is how people get caught up in thinking they are the label, they are the title. If they like the title, they become huffed and puffed. If they have a title that is named after someone lower, or then you feel not so good. No, you feel unproud. You feel very unproud. So this shows how suggestive our mind is. And it makes us to believe and perceive things between the two dogs, or whatever. How quickly our mind is very much a dictator when it is not aware that all objects are opinion of the subject. So if both parties have this kind of mutual understanding, then there's a lot of flexibility how quickly the object can change, because all things are not only changing as a fixed kind of physical entity like the table holding the top together by 4 legs and so on, but there is much more than the 4 legs of a table that makes a table. How about the labels? Those who have chosen to give the label. Some people might think it's a bench top, or some people might think a coffee. But how does an object appears and makes you to convince itself as name? Because even the most conventional convention to own object, they're actually named after something by somebody. Itself was never said, I like this name, please adopt me with this name as soon as born. There is no such thing. So all things need labeling, and we have to highlight it, we have to stick the label on the forehead or put the door. So when you're delivering the letter next week, at least you wouldn't go to some other houses thinking that's where you live. They will know exactly the blue top, blue roof, or red fence, or whatever you see. You just say that's my something. So therefore, as soon as you adopt that, then the thing itself sort of becomes a lot more closer to you, and but you do not feel alone or lonely at the least, because you realize how constructive and even manipulative your own mind is to project things outside when it doesn't exist, and project things among those who are doing various duties. So this shows the deluded sentient beings. To the deluded sentient beings, all objects looks like independently existing from their own side, and the fool doesn't know that they had themselves labeled those objects with this name. As a result of therefore these things appear where they do. And so that's a very important understanding that one needs to cultivate in this context. And in meditation, we first use a certain object to focus on. The reason we focus our mind on the object, not because we need to focus on the object, but we need to spot our mind. But more we tell ourselves to focus on the breath or on the Buddha image or whatever, And then because we are calling the object chosen by the name as an object, whether we have to visualize, whether we have to see it as an entity or something, then only the mind will get some kind of understand the role the mind plays in making it believe what the thing is. And otherwise, its mind as a observed object of the meditation is you couldn't spot it, yellow, red, male, female, Indo-European, Asian, Africa. You couldn't tell the name that is identical to the object. So you can say, as when you see the objects are not object, but objects are thought about the object. Then you realize, why do I keep projecting my thought onto this object? Because you relatively have looked at things and they are labeled, and you think they are exactly as they are labeled. We don't realize that the label is very temporary and may prove to be completely not congruent with what the object is in a relatively speaking. When you're able to do this, what is relative, what is ultimate in terms of why the object manifests as a mind or why object manifests as object. So in a relative level, people say that you are an object is what we call him, and but don't realize it is our calling that makes the object. But they think the object is independently there to be perceived. So that's why when you meditate yourself, say on the breath or the posture or a Buddha image, a flower, whatever you do, all of these are so that you can see your thought about the object. When you see that, then all of these thought are decidedly to be chosen in this hierarchy to focus on this and try to develop calm abiding and mindfulness and so on. By designing these various techniques, we're actually making people to see their mind, how they are forming opinions and labels and sticks the label to external objects. And it's just a mere convention. It's nothing great or bad about it. That's how all things are labeled. And most things that are labeled is not the thing at all. It's labeled after someone else. So someone else is not there in the person, but one is using the name of someone else to name you. So that shows you are not the name at all. It's good to have a mind that sees that the object is not being myself. The object is named after somebody and you're not identical to it. So in this way, one is shaken a little bit in this way of looking, but in the long run realize how skillful it is to know that things are not as they seem to appear before me. So things that appear before us is largely prejudices and projections and fear and anxieties and things that one hasn't dealt with. Then one can project those things on the objects and not knowing it is one's mind that is the object, but they think it's the object that are object of her mind. So there's a huge difference, One who knows how one's mind is giving label and therefore things are appearing as they are, then that's what makes us, we are so attached to the worldly pursuits in the physical world. So the purpose of this talk is to observe that it is actually our mind that is manifesting and labeled to the object. When you have that, you have greater tendency and freedom to withdraw the name, remove the name, and not make the thing totally as any parts of the object. Because the object doesn't look like the subject. And why should you put a subject as a head or something, only to make a matter worse? So in order to clarify and enjoy the great expanse of the unbounded, clear, luminous nature of the mind, one needs to know that all objects are opinions and thought formed in the mind of the persons who sharingly named it. When you have that, there's a great capacity not become embroiled in you not being able to see the object, seeing the object as merely labeled from concept from this end. And when you know that, if you change your thought about the object, the label of the object changes, and it doesn't take long to heal. It doesn't take long to clarify, because that's all it matters to clarify. To clarify, the object is not object. Object is what we think it is. And that means when you think something else, also it manifests that way. So that shows how versatile the understanding of this mind and its role is, whether in relation to things as an object or about anything for that matter. Because this means we will be able to take back some of the thought that we thought is them, but actually our thought thinking is them makes us to make them see with the particular appearance. And so therefore we are the projectors, we are the causes of those thoughts. If you consciously project those thoughts and consciously repair that, you will have a great kind of fitness with which you feel vibrant and understanding the things on the relative level. And therefore would never forget to meditate on the profound meaning of this nature of the mind that does convening names, labeling names when she wanted to do that. So with this, we will conclude here, everyone. Please feel free to share and comments on these talks, and so we wish you have a good afternoon. Thank you very much, everyone. So at the conclusion of the teaching, we do the dedication of merit by listening and talking about this. May we know how things are not as they appear. Things are as we think. As we think they are, they appear as our opinion in the object. So basically we are only observing our mind, but not seeing it as a mind, and we think as object independently exists from its own side. And that is the cause of the many, many wrong views. And therefore we point finger at things without realizing how much we have to change our attitude for those objects to appear differently. Then they definitely will appear differently. Also, we'll do the dedication merits. Thank you very much. Om Bodhi Mare Havaga Dajiva Menzage Honez Me Ale Berada Bivrande Oshana Badezenede Herenda Mahayana Diji Whatever merit I have, me ho be gazelevas to hoda mahayana tiji courage manju shinyu as amanda badra de lava following all the hills ambo I should dig all the mere Salam Bodhi Jida Treba Vedanaya Danza where it has been Bomayading freely without Jana. Thank you, everyone. Take care.